give you just a minute to get there. Nahum for me is like whenever you're teaching your kids the alphabet, and Elemento is one letter for them. They started teaching our kids like a different song so that Elemento is more than one letter. But for me, the way that I remember the books is I remember them in chunks. And so the chunk that I remember is Jonah, Micah, Nahum. And so Jonah, Micah, Nahum is how I get there, if that helps you to find where we're going. While you're turning there and we're getting started, I will go ahead and let you all know that Teddy Bricky has expressed her desire to be a part of our church family back here. So Teddy's in the back, and I wish that this was like a rah-rah, but Teddy's in a storm right now, and we all know it's gone out to the congregation, and so it's a great time for you to be a part of this church family, and we are already your family and here for you in the time. Teddy's going to be here for, I think you have a 10-month contract, right? And so she'll be here for 10 months unless she falls in love with Ellisville and the area and decides she wants to stay. So we'll see about that. But welcome, Teddy. We're glad that you are with us for now and for the foreseeable future anyway. I'm going to throw this up as we get started in Nahum chapter 1 and verse 1. Oh, I'm sorry. I need to check to make sure the mic is on because I don't know if they can hear me outside. Got it. Nahum chapter 1 and verse 1 says, an oracle concerning Nineveh. This is one of only a small number of books in the Bible that is written. It's actually written to. I hesitate, and I'll say this in just a minute why I hesitate, but it's written to people who are not God's people. Nineveh is the capital of Assyria. And so here is Nahum prophesying and speaking concerning non-Jewish people who are actually enemies of God's people, which is really an amazing thing. And so I think it will be useful for us to consider this. This map is confusing. I almost didn't use this map, but it will at least help this way. The different colors. This is the Assyrian Empire throughout history. And so the different colors are Assyria starting out small. That's going to be this little section right here. This is originally this is the OG Assyria. And there's Nineveh. This is modern day Iraq. Nineveh on the map right there, right on there is modern day Mosul. So whenever you hear about Mosul in the news and some of the stuff that happens, I think you'll hear it in the context almost always of Navy SEALs and the work that they do in Mosul. That's that city. That's Nineveh. And then they expanded. I think that if you will ignore the red and the green down here. So think about like this brown and this whole area back up here. That's going to be the Assyria that Jonah worked with. They had grown just a little bit. They were not at full strength or full size yet, but that's what Jonah was dealing with. And then this, obviously, the green expansion down into the Holy Land territory. Here's going to be, you see that dot right there? That's going to be the Sea of Galilee. That's going to be the expansion in 722 when Assyria eventually came and conquered Israel. And that lasted for a while. And there's something worth knowing here. So we've made it to 722 on our timeline right now. And now go about 20, 21 years forward. It's always hard when you're doing BC numbers, but go forward in time from 722 to 701. That's going to be about the time of Hezekiah. And the green comes all the way down to this area, but you see the red circle around Jerusalem? Do you remember that God saved Jerusalem? And not all maps do this. but they should do this. The Assyrian Empire expanded and they conquered all of the promised land except Jerusalem. They never got Jerusalem. That's Hezekiah's tunnel. If you don't know about that, that's really neat to just do a little Google search and look at Hezekiah's tunnel, and you can see how God saved them. This is the time of Isaiah, what we were talking about last week. And so that's going to be the green that expands down here. And then what happened, this is going to bring us to the book of Nahum. Assyria expanded. They came all the way down here into Egypt, and the green territory is, they just went right down the Nile River to Thebes, which is about as far as they got. Which matters. This is why I put this map up on the board, because it helps you to see that this is Assyria at their greatest might, as big as they were, and they went to Thebes, and they were never stronger in their history than they are right now. Well, if you will look at Nehemiah chapter 3 and verses 8 through 10, this helps us to put a timestamp on the book of Nahum and know where it is and what's coming. Nahum chapter 3, starting in verse 8, God says to Assyria, "Are you better than Thebes?" That's this. When he says that, he's talking about this city right here. And he says to Assyria, "Are you better than them that sat by the Nile with water around her, her rampart a sea, and water her wall? Cush was her strength, Egypt too, and that without limits. Put and the Libyans were her helpers, yet she became an exile. She went into captivity." This is still talking about Thebes. "Her infants were dashed in pieces at the head of every street. For her honored men, lots were cast, and all her great men were bound in chains." And so we've got a time here. We know that Assyria came down and took the city of Thebes in 663. You can put a timestamp on that. And so if you don't have a study Bible that has this information up there for you, right up here where it says Nahum, if you put date, when did Nahum talk? Well, it was at least after 663, and you can point to Nahum chapter 3, 8, 9, and 10 to point to that, because we know when Thebes fell. And the book of Nahum is saying to Assyria, you are going to be conquered, and we know that that happened in 612 by Babylon. And so Nahum falls somewhere in this time period, which I think if you will stop for just a second and look at the map and think about this, Nahum falls in this time period when Assyria is strong and powerful. And he comes to them while they're strong and powerful and says, you're eventually going to be destroyed. Which kind of packs a punch, I think. It packs a punch to feel what's really happening in this book. So do this. Stick your marker here in Nahum and go to Isaiah chapter 10. We read this last week, but I want to read it again. In Isaiah chapter 10, this is a chapter where God is condemning Assyria. And there's two things to help us with the book of Nahum. The first thing to think of when you think of Assyria is extreme arrogance. This is a group of people, especially now, with their arms flexed, saying, look how powerful we are. Nobody can stop us. That's going to be Isaiah chapter 10 and verses 12 through 14. When the Lord had finished all his works on Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, he will punish the speech of the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria and the boastful look in his eyes. For he says, this is Assyria's mindset. By the strength of my hand I have done this, and by my wisdom, for I have understanding, I remove the boundaries of peoples and plunder their treasures. Like a bull, I bring down those who sit on thrones. My hand has found like a nest the wealth of the peoples. As one gathers eggs that have been forsaken, so I have gathered all the earth, and there was none that moved a wing or opened the mouth or chirped. Here's Assyria. Nobody even looks at me sideways. And so this extreme arrogance is going to be something that you're going to see in Nahum. There's another thing that you're going to see in Nahum, and since you're in Isaiah chapter 10, if you'll look back up to verses 5 and 6, it's not just that they are extremely arrogant. Assyria was extremely violent. I'm talking about vicious. And I'll show you some stuff here in just a second to do this. And what I also would like for you to do, I'd kind of like for you to do this at home. Not now, but when you get home, I'll point you to a website at the British Museum that you can look at some of the stuff that we'll talk about. But here's God talking about their violence. In Isaiah chapter 10 and verses 5 and 6, God is saying, "Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger. The staff in their hands is my fury. Against a godless nation I send him, and against the people of my wrath I command him to take the spoil and seize plunder, and to tread them down like the mire in the streets." And one of the things that's a little bit tough as you think about this situation, God says to Assyria, "You are my tool. You are accomplishing my purposes. But that doesn't mean that you're just free to just go out into the world with complete reckless abandon and be as violent and brutal and cruel as you want to be." And so back in Nahum, the key passage for me is going to be Nahum chapter 3 and verse 1. And it's not even the whole passage. You can read down. We will in a minute. But really, it's chapter 3 and verse 1 where God says, "Woe to the bloody city." You're going to see their violence in the book of Nahum. So here's what I would like for you to look at. And this is how you're going to find this on Google. Well, you could text me and I'll send you a link. Or you can search for this. It's called Assyrian wall reliefs. And what this is the Assyrians, whenever they made their palaces in their capital, these were the walls. So this is in the British Museum, and you can see what it would have been like to walk into the palace of the Assyrian kings. This is their wall, and what this is it's a relief telling the story in pictures of Assyria taking the city of Lachish. So that's how you're going to find it. Assyrian wall reliefs of Lachish. And Lachish is just like 30 miles south of Jerusalem. So this is actually the fight against God's people. I don't know who gave this book to me. I'm partly saying this right now because I would kind of like to know if I suspect it was somebody in this congregation. I don't know who it was, but somebody gave me a book about the museum in Iraq, in Mosul, where it used to be. And what's horrible about this is when the Iraq war started, the whole museum was just looted and destroyed. And so this is in the British Museum, but a lot of the things that you would find from this time period is only preserved in pictures and books and the black market. But it's really a horrible thing. So here's what, these are close-ups of the wall that we were looking at right now. If you look at the siege of Lachish, here's the city. Imagine the city of Lachish is here. Assyria had to build a siege ramp, and they had stuff to go up the hill, and so their taking the city is going up. And you'll see with their bow and arrows, which I guess that's not really that violent. That's war, and that's instruments of war. That's how you fight. And so I'm not really critical of that. But look at this next picture. After they took the city, before they were finished with the war, a couple of guys decided to take some Jewish prisoners and stick them on a stick and plant the sticks in the ground to say, here's what's coming for all of the rest of you. They just impaled people, and I don't know how you do this, but when you look at the British Museum website and you read about each of these reliefs, there's some way of knowing that those guys are still alive while they're impaled on the sticks. Maybe it's just because Assyria, it was just so horribly brutal. Look at this picture, and I'm not trying to gross you out or anything like that. I'm trying to get a taste of what we're looking at in this book of Nahum and the violence that's being condemned. Look, these are prisoners, and it looks like they're being stretched out. But look at what the Assyrians are doing. They're flaying their calves. And so it's torture by slicing off pieces of their body just a little at a time. Here's a guy whose head has been cut off, and here's a guy whose head is being cut off. So these things are, I say special by themselves, but what makes it extra special is when the Assyrian king said, I want some decoration in my palace where I sit all of the time. These are the pictures that they use to decorate their room. So it's not just history, it's when you walk into the Assyrian king, they want you to know who they are and what happens to their enemies. That's what some of these wall reliefs are. And this picture is them taking captives, which we know about in the Old Testament. They defeated their enemies, and then they carried them off captive to other places. And so here are the Assyrians driving the captives away and carrying away all of their stuff. And so as we read through, it's only 3 chapters, so we can read the whole book and go through this stuff. But as we read through Nahum, what I want you to know, as you read what God said to this group of people, is that they are extremely arrogant and extremely violent. And one of the reasons why I'm saying this about all of this stuff is because if you have a study Bible, or if you look up anything on the book of Nahum, one of the very first things that you're going to find is a criticism of the book where people say, I mean, it's kind of an obscure book anyway, but one of the criticisms of Nahum is God is awfully mean and cruel to these people. You'll find it in almost all of your resources. And rather than reading this and thinking, wow, God is awfully mean to these people, what we should think is these people are getting from God what they've done to everybody else. That's what's going on in this book. So chapter 1 and verses, let's start in verse 1, but we'll read down through verse 11. And what this is this is a description of God. Do you remember how Assyria said, nobody can touch me. I'm the big and powerful. Nobody even flinches at me. This is how Nahum starts with a description of God. And he says, no, you're wrong. God is the untouchable one. Verse 1, an oracle concerning Nineveh, book of the vision of Nahum of Elkosh. The Lord is a jealous and avenging God. The Lord is avenging and wrathful. The Lord takes vengeance on his adversaries and keeps wrath for his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger and great in power, and the Lord will by no means clear the guilty. His way is in a whirlwind and storm, and the clouds are the dust of his feet. He rebukes the sea and makes it dry. He dries up all the rivers. Bashan and Carmel wither. The bloom of Lebanon withers. The mountains quake before him. The hills melt. The earth heaves before him. The world and all who dwell in it. Who can stand before his indignation? I like to think that Nahum knows what Isaiah said about Assyria. Nobody can stand in our way. And Nahum is responding and says, who can stand before God's indignation? Who can endure the heat of his anger? His wrath is poured out like fire, and the rocks are broken into pieces by him. The Lord is good, a stronghold in a day of trouble. He knows those who take refuge in him. but with an overflowing flood, he will make a complete end of the adversaries and will pursue his enemies into darkness. What do you plot against the Lord? He will make a complete end. Trouble will not rise up a second time, for they are like entangled thorns, like drunkards as they drink. They are consumed like stubble, fully dried. From you came one who plotted evil against the Lord, a worthless counselor. You have no chance. And what I love about this, I don't know if it's right to call this propaganda or not. War propaganda. This prophecy, this is God's inspired word. But what I love about this word is that he's speaking it to this empire at their biggest and their strongest. And in the midst of their might, Nahum speaks and says, you're nothing before God, compared to God. He's going to get burned up in his fiery anger. So that's part one. And so if you do this sort of thing, I just make a little note up here. Verses 2 through 11 is a description of Yahweh in this context. Okay, then you have a second section. Chapter 1 and verse 12 down to chapter 2 and verse 13. And I made little notes, and I did this with pencil. But I made little notes because it's hard to read. He switches back and forth. He's talking to Assyria and Nineveh, and then he's talking to Judah. And then he's talking to Assyria, and then he's talking to Judah. And then Assyria, and then Judah. And there's not really many things, at least in my Bible, to help me know when that switch happens. And so I just made little notes in here. And so, verse 12, God is speaking to Assyria. Thus says the Lord, though they are at full strength and many, they will be cut down and pass away. Now he switches and he's talking about Judah, God's people. Though I have afflicted you, I will afflict you no more. And now I will break his yoke from off you and burst your bonds apart. I'm going to free you from these people. Now he's going to switch and talk to Assyria again. The Lord has given commandment about you. No more shall your name be perpetuated. From the house of your gods I will cut off the carved image, and the metal image I will make your grave, for you are vile. Now he's going to switch and talk to God's people. Judah again. Verse 15. Behold, upon the mountains, the feet of him who brings good news, who publishes peace. That ought to sound familiar. We'll finish with that. Behold, upon the mountains, the feet of him who brings good news, who publishes peace. Keep your feast, O Judah, fulfill your vows, for never again shall the worthless pass through you. He is utterly cut off. Chapter 2, keep rolling. He's going to talk to Assyria now. The scatterer has come up against you. Man the ramparts, watch the road, dress for battle, collect your strength. So God is coming against Assyria, and he's saying, get yourself ready, Assyria, because here comes the battle. Verse 2, back to Judah. For the Lord is restoring the majesty of Jacob as the majesty of Israel, for plunderers have plundered them and ruined their branches. And now in verse 3 down through verse 13, we have Assyria and their destruction. Verse 3. The shield of his mighty men is red. His soldiers are clothed in scarlet. The chariots come with flashing metal. On the day he musters them, the cypress spears are brandished. You know, as I read through all of this, I can't help but think of this. Assyria decorated their walls with their spears and their bows and their military might. And this description is, here is God coming against you in the way that you came against others. Verse 4. The chariots race madly through the streets. They rush to and fro through the squares. They gleam like torches. They dart like lightning. He remembers his officers. They stumble as they go. They haste to the wall. The siege tower is set up. The river gates are open. The palace melts away. Its mistress is stripped. She is carried off. Her slave girls lamenting, moaning like doves, and beating their breasts. Nineveh is like a pool whose water runs away. That's a Bible verse worth remembering. God's enemy is like a pool, and the water just flows away. And now it's gone. Verse 9. Oh, sorry, the rest of verse 8. Halt! Halt! They cry out, but none turns back. Plunder the silver, plunder the gold. There is no end of the treasure, or of the wealth of all precious things. Desolate, desolation and ruin. Hearts melt and knees tremble. Anguish is in all loins. All faces grow pale. Where is the lion's den? The feeding place of the young lions, where the lion and the lioness went, where his cubs were, with none to disturb. Where is the mighty lion, Assyria, with all of his people? The lion tore enough for his cubs and strangled prey for his lioness. He filled his cave with prey and his den with torn flesh. Behold, I am against you, declares the Lord of hosts, and I will burn your chariots in smoke, and the sword shall devour your young lions. I will cut off your prey from the earth, and the voice of your messengers shall no longer be heard. So Assyria thinks they're pretty bad stuff, and God says, you are nothing compared to me. As we get into chapter 3, I don't know if this is really, like, you can't just write this down and divide this out like an outline. But I have at least a note in chapter 3 and verse 1. It kind of switches because now it sounds like God is going to say, all of that horribly violent stuff that you did to other people, now it's your turn. Chapter 3 and verse 1. Woe to the bloody city, all full of lies and plunder, no end to the prey, the crack of the whip and rumble of the wheel, galloping horses, bounding chariot, horsemen charging, flashing sword and glittering spear, host of slain, heaps of corpses. There's one, heaps of corpses. I've got something for you here. Let's see if I can find this real quick. I know I put it in my notes. This is one of the things. Yeah, this is Assyria before the time of Jonah. This is an Assyrian inscription. I captured many soldiers alive. The rest I burnt. I built a pile of live men and heads before their gate. I burnt their adolescent boys and girls. So he's bragging about how he built a pile of living men. And here we are in chapter 3 and verse 3, what God says, heaps of corpses, dead bodies without ends. They stumble over the bodies. And all for the countless whorings of the prostitute, graceful and of deadly charms, who betrays nations with her whorings and peoples with her charms. Behold, I am against you, declares the Lord of hosts. I will lift up the skirt over your face, and I will make nations look at your nakedness and kingdoms at your shame. I will throw filth at you and treat you with contempt and make you a spectacle. And all who look at you will shrink from you and say, wasted is Nineveh. Who will grieve for her? Where shall I seek comforters for her? Are you better than Thebes that sat by the Nile with water around her, her rampart at sea, her rampart a sea, and water her wall? Cush was her strength, Egypt too, and that without limits. Put and the Libyans were her helpers. Yet she, Thebes, became an exile. She went into captivity. Her infants were dashed into pieces at the head of every street. For her honored men, lots were cast, and all her great men were bound in chains. And what God is saying is, that thing that you did to other people, your turn is coming. Verse 11, you also will be drunken. You will go into hiding. You will seek a refuge from the enemy. All your fortresses are like fig trees with ripe figs. If shaken, they fall into the mouth of the eater. Behold, your troops are women in your midst. The gates of your land are wide open to your enemies. Fire has devoured your bars. And then in verses 14 through 19, you have Assyria. It's a picture of Assyria getting ready. Okay, God's coming against us and he's going to fight. We better collect our strength and get ready to fight against him. You're wasting your time. Verse 14. Okay, get ready. Draw water for the siege. Strengthen your forts. Go into the clay. Tread the mortar. Take hold of the brick mold. There will be... There the fire will devour you. The sword will cut you off. It will devour you like the locust. Multiply yourselves like the locust. Multiply like grasshoppers. You increase your merchants more than the stars of the heaven. The locust spread its wings and flies away. Get as big and as strong and as powerful as you want to be. 17. Your princes are like grasshoppers. Your scribes like clouds of locusts settling on the fences. In a day of cold when the sun rises, they fly away. No one knows where they are. Your shepherds are asleep, O king of Assyria. Your nobles slumber. Your people are scattered on the mountains with none to gather them. There is no easing your hurt. Your wound is grievous. All who hear the news about you clap their hands over you, for upon whom has not come your unceasing evil. And so I can understand why somebody would be critical of the book and say, wow, God is mean to these people. You got to know the context, though, and who he's talking to and why he's saying the things that he's saying. So let's finish up. Just a couple last things. This is, I think, a two-part message. This is our takeaway, and the two-part message makes the one-sentence summary of the book. This is what I take away from this book. First and foremost, before everything else, even though this prophecy is spoken to Assyria and Nineveh, it is written and recorded in the Bible of God's people. And so it's for us. It's written to them, but it's for us. And what God wants us to know is at least a couple of things. Chapter 1 and verse 7. The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble. He knows those who take refuge in him. This arrogant and violent people have come against you and come against the entire ancient Middle Eastern world. And what God wants us to know is that in the face of a threat like that, we have a God who is bigger than those things. There is something worth considering in verses 12 and 13. Chapter 1 and verses 12 and 13. I guess the second part of verse 12. God says to Judah, though I have afflicted you, be sure your sin brought this upon you. God says, Assyria is my instrument. Though I have afflicted you, I will afflict you no more. And now I will break his yoke from off you, and I will burst your bonds apart. Chapter 2 and verse 2. For the Lord is restoring the majesty of Jacob as the majesty of Israel. For plunderers have plundered them and ruined their branches. And so I don't know if you feel the same stress that I feel, but this message was extremely useful for me in these last couple of weeks. Surely I can't be the only person in our country who feels like I'm losing my mind. Like I look at the world around us and I think, maybe I'm the crazy one. Because everybody else seems to have just lost their mind. And the things that they're saying are true, and the things that they're saying are real, and the stuff that's going on in our world right now. And when it seems like the craziness is surrounding you and overwhelming, the message of Nahum is, our God is even bigger than that. What a great takeaway, I think, not only for this group of people, but for us. And then here is my other one, and I'll just use one passage as an illustration of this. Chapter 1 and verse 2. The Lord is a jealous and avenging God. The Lord is avenging and wrathful. The Lord takes vengeance on his adversaries and keeps wrath for his enemies. One approach towards Nahum might be, wow, God is mean to people. My approach to Nahum is, I don't want to be on his bad side. If this is what God does to his enemies, every single thing in my life and in my home with my kids and my family is, let's be right with God. Let's not be on the wrong side of this. Because it is absolutely a truth throughout the Scripture that God is not messing around when it comes to those who are his enemies, and I don't want to be one of them. Okay, one last thing. I have tried to connect everything to Jesus, and so this would be the Jesus connection here. This is the last thing we'll do. I'm almost done. In 1:12, God says to Assyria, and then he says to Judah, and then he says to Assyria, and then he says to Judah, in the midst of their Assyrian crisis, here's what God says to his people, 1:15. Behold upon the mountains the feet of him who brings good news, who publishes peace. Keep your feast, O Judah, fulfill your vows, for never again shall the worthless pass through you. He is utterly cut off. This, upon the mountains, the feet of him who brings good news. Here I am in Jerusalem, hiding from my enemy, and I see up on the hill, running towards me, a messenger. And the messenger is coming to say, God's enemies have been defeated, and we are free from the tyranny of these arrogant and violent people. This is the guy running to tell us to publish peace. And this is a passage quoted in Romans chapter 10. If you'll turn over there, in Romans chapter 10, I'm going to start in verse 9. Our actual verse is not until a little bit later. You'll see it, but I'm going to start reading in verse 9. Also, the one who comes publishing peace running over the mountains. You'll see a reference probably. Also, you can find that in Isaiah, who was about the same time as Nahum. This is the message of God to his people during this time. So chapter 10, starting in verse 9, and I'm going to read down to verse 15. Because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. You will be saved. That's the message of God to his people in the face of the Assyrian threat. Here is salvation for you. Verse 10. For with the heart one believes and is justified, with the mouth one confesses and is saved. For the scripture says, everyone who believes in him will not be put to shame. For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek. For the same Lord is Lord of all, bestowing his riches on all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him in whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news. Have they not all obeyed the gospel? For Isaiah says, the Lord is a believer. And so you can read the rest of the context if you want, but the great thing about this passage and the way that this passage uses Nahum is that you are the guy running over the mountains. And you are running to your friends and your family with the message that they can be saved from their enemies. The preacher who runs to share the good news of salvation, that God has completely defeated death and all those who stand against him. I think that's a pretty neat story and a pretty neat way to use Nahum. So, the book of Nahum. God's enemies, your days are numbered. God's people, I will save you. For those of you who are outside, I don't have enough printouts for this, but Kevin's got an invitation song that's not in the songbook. And so we'll have this invitation song not in the songbook, and then he's got another song after that that is in the songbook. If you're here tonight and you're not a Christian, I'm the guy bringing good news. You can be saved from your enemies, but only through Jesus. If you want to do that tonight, come forward. Make your needs known as together we stand and